going to switch gears now and hear from Sabrina Hansmann-Roth, who is going to present her work with Arne Christensen. Go ahead and take it away, Sabrina.
Okay, you see my slides and you also hear me?
Yes.
Right? Okay, so perfect. Does this also work? No. Okay, like this. Okay, perfect. So our visual environment contains lots of statistical regularities that can be quantified as probability distributions. So for example, in any natural scene, colors at adjacent locations are likely to be similar because they belong to the same object, like for example, these patches of white snow. And an important question that arises from this is whether the visual system really encodes the entire color distribution of this image, for example, or whether some details are lost and replaced with rough summary descriptions, like, for example, the average color. And in this case here for this image, this would result in a color that is hardly in the image because the distribution had a rather bimodal shape. So indeed, representing visual information as summary statistics, such as mean or the variance, has been studied a lot within the topic of ensemble perception. So observers can relatively accurately estimate the mean size or the mean orientation. They can also differentiate between sets that have different variance. But optimal behavior really requires more than summary statistics to obtain a correct or a generative model of the environment. And here's an example of how information is lost when a distribution is replaced by its summary statistics. So the average and the variance of these x and y values in these three images are identical. However, you can see that they lead to really quite different distributions. And the same is true when you think about a Gaussian and a uniform distribution. They can have the same mean and the same variance, but they still look quite different when you look at them. So overall, the results from the ensemble perception literature really showed that observers can discriminate sets of stimuli that are based on differences in mean and variance, but not when they differ in their skewness or kurtosis of the distribution. So that meant that, at least from the literature and ensemble perception, you can conclude that higher order statistics are not encoded. But the question really is whether the details about this distribution are thrown away during the summarizing process, or whether these explicit tests, as they're applied in the ensemble perception literature, kind of fail to reveal all the knowledge that an observer really has. So in our lab, we recently proposed a new method to study the ability of the visual system to extract probabilistic information from a visual scene by not using these explicit tests as they were used before. So in the approach that we are using, so in this paradigm, the observer constantly has to search for an oddly colored target among a set of distractors. And these distractor colors are drawn from a particular distribution. So in this example, from a Gaussian distribution. And the goal is to assess whether the details of this distractor distribution are encoded. So the observer does a bunch of learning trials. And during these learning trials, the distribution characteristics are held constant. And then these learning trials are interrupted by a so-called test trial. And the test trial is just another search for the subject. But the target color now on the test trial comes from either within the previous distractor distribution, or it comes from outside the distribution, so it's somewhat new color to the observer. And when the target color comes from within the previous distractor distribution, that means that the current target color is a previous distractor color. We know from experiments in visual search that in these cases, the searches are relatively slow compared to when you're presented with a new color, because the trick behind this is that the visual system kind of learned to ignore certain colors, and now it suddenly has to attend to it. And that kind of switch takes a bit of time, and therefore you get slower searches when it's a previous distractor color. So we thought that if the probabilities of these distractor colors are encoded during these learning trials, then the search times on this test trial, they should vary as a function of the probability of the target color being a previous distractor color. So what we did was we plot the search time only from the test trials against the distance between the previous distractor mean and the current target color in color space. And then when we do that, we do actually see that the RT functions, they really nicely resemble the underlying distractor distribution shape. So here are two examples for a Gaussian and a uniform distribution. And this really demonstrates that the visual system does encode the shape of a feature distribution in this experiment color, and it uses it to guide behavior. So it seems that there is some sort of discrepancy between the results from ensemble perception and this implicit method that I just showed to you. So the main question remains is whether these two approaches really measure the same underlying representation. So what are the potential ways that the visual system may represent a stimulus distribution? So one option is that we could assume that these implicit estimates and these explicit estimates are directly calculated from the same noisy probabilistic representation. And the second option is that this noisy probabilistic representation is used to generate an implicit estimate, but also to generate a summary representation that has the mean and the variance encoded, from which then the explicit estimate is taken from. And then there's a third option, which assumes that this stimulus distribution that you see in the visual world generates two different representations, a noisy probabilistic representation and a summary representation. And the crucial aspect of these summary representations is that the summary representations do not encode the distribution shape of the stimulus distribution anymore, only mean and variance. And one important characteristic of this independent distribution is that it's really different from the other ones because it does not assume any common sources of noise between the summary representation and the probabilistic representation, because these are really distinct representations. And this is exactly what we wanted to study. So how independent are these two representations that we found, the summary representation and the probabilistic representation? And we're doing that by looking at the correlations between the precision and the variability between these two estimates. So we're doing that by combining a set of 4 experiments. So the first experiment is just our classic implicit method. So the observer is just searching for oddly colored target throughout the experiment. And then we're also using a set of experiments, so experiment 2 to 4, which is a combination of these search tasks. And then on the test trial, we're replacing the search task by a 2 ARC task. So the observer searches for a bunch of trials and then is suddenly presented with 2 distractor sets and has to indicate which of these 2 sets look more like the previous distractor sets during the learning trials. And we're performing 3 different experiments because in each experiment, we are manipulating only one of the distribution characteristics. So in one experiment, the mean color differs between these 2 sets. In one experiment, the standard deviation differs between these 2 experiments. And in the last one, the distribution shape differs between these 2 different experiments. And when we're using these different shapes, and we're using a set of different distractor distributions ranging from normal to uniform. So you can imagine that you do a bunch of search trials, you're searching for target among green colored distractors, and then you suddenly come to your test trial. And then on the test trial, you would, for example, see these 2 sets here on the top. You would logically choose the set on the right because you were just presented with green colored distractors. So let's first look at the results from experiment 1, so the implicit experiment. And you might remember this figure from my introduction that really nicely showed how the RT functions resemble the underlying distractor distribution shape. And the results from the new experiment, they look really similar. So again, you can see that this RT function nicely resembles the underlying distribution shape of the distractors, which really means that observers do have a remarkable detailed representation of the distractor distribution well above mean and variance, which is normally predicted by the experiments from ensemble perception. So we could nicely replicate our previous results. But now we really want to assess the properties of this underlying internal representation. And in particular, we're interested in the precision and the variability. So from these RT functions, for each observer, we extracted the mean, which is a measure of a bias, and we extracted the standard deviation of this RT function, which is a measure of our variability. And we're doing that for all our observers. So each data point here corresponds to 1 observer. So this is the average bias, so the mean. This is the average variability. And from both these estimates, we can then also calculate the precision, aka the standard deviation. And now we can use these estimates to compare them with the variability and the precision of the explicit experiment that I haven't shown you yet, to investigate whether the underlying representation really share common sources of noise or whether these two representations are independent. So for the explicit experiment, so we plotted psychrometric functions to our data to really determine whether the observer can pick the correct distractor set. So remember, observers were searching and then were suddenly presented with these two sets, and they had to indicate which set was the previous distractor set. This is an example for our experiment in which we varied the mean color between the two sets, and you can already see that observers can do the task. So if they're presented with green distractor sets for a bunch of trials while searching for a target, they can correctly identify the distractor set. And the same is true for our experiment in which we manipulated or varied the standard deviation between the two sets. So again, observers can pick the correct distractor set, which means that in both cases, mean and standard deviation of the distribution is encoded because they explicitly ask about these features in these test trials. But for the shape, it does not work. So again, if we present two distractor sets to the observer and they have to pick the correct distractor set, they cannot do the task. So they're basically entirely a chance performance. And this is really in direct contrast to the results that I just showed you on the slide before, where I told you that implicitly the observer encodes the distractor distribution. It means that there is implicit encoding, but when the observer is explicitly asked about it, they're entirely a chance performance and cannot do the task. So now we have our results, both from the explicit experiment and also from the implicit experiment. And now, so we already extracted the bias and the variability, and now we have to do the same for our explicit results. But we can obviously only do this for the mean and the standard deviation task, because for the shape one, you cannot even fit a psychrometric function because this was entirely a chance. So we fitted this cumulative Gaussian psychrometric functions to our data. And from this, we can extract the mean and the standard deviation of the underlying Gaussian distribution. So the standard deviation, just as a reminder, is the inverse of the slope, and the mean is the PSE. And we extract these for all our observers. And then we take the grand average and the standard deviation around these estimates, which means that, again, we get an average bias estimate, we get our estimate for the variability, and we also get the precision around these estimates. And then we can directly compare them to our implicit results. So this is now just the results for correlations between the explicit estimates. So on the y-axis, you have the average variability of the SD task against the average variability in the mean explicit task, and the same down here for precision. And you can indeed see that the results for both of them highly correlate with each other, meaning that observers with a more precise representation of the mean, they also have a more precise representation of the standard deviation, since both of them are extracted from the same encoded summary representation. And the next and final step is to investigate whether the variability and precision between the implicit and explicit estimate also correlate. And this would, if this is the case, this would suggest that there is a link between the representation of the distractors, the summary representation and the probabilistic representation. However, we found no correlation between the implicit and the explicit estimates. So on the y-axis in all four plots, you have the implicit results for average variability and also for the precision down here, the purple data points. And on the x-axis, you have either the explicit mean task or the explicit standard deviation task. But you see that the results are basically the same. So there seems to be no correlation between the implicit and the explicit method. That means that a noisier summary representation does not automatically mean that there's also a noisier probabilistic representation. So to conclude, the main question was, how precisely are feature distributions encoded? So is detailed information about a feature distribution retained during the summarizing process? Yes, our implicit method showed that detailed information is kept and implicitly encoded. And we found strong correlations between the explicit estimates, but not between explicit and implicit, which really hints that explicit and implicit judgments do not share common sources of noise and are therefore unlikely to reflect the same neural representations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. That was awesome. I was wondering, and I haven't quite worked out how you would get at this, but would you find the same summary representation if the target isn't defined by that distractor distribution? So if there's some array of color, but color is no longer relevant to the task, like are those summary statistics still coming along for the ride just because you encoded the scene?
So I did like 2 years ago, I did an experiment where I looked at the this shape encoding by using two different features, so orientation and color at the same time, meaning that you have lines that have a particular orientation, and then you find the target either based on color only or on orientation only. So meaning that the question for us was whether you still learn the distribution of the irrelevant feature that's not defining the target, but it's kind of there. And you do lose the shape encoding. You still get some information about the average color or the average orientation, so that kind of comes along just by being presented to it. But we do see that this nice resembling of the shape, so these RT functions that really look like the distribution. So I don't know whether I can show this again. Like here, so this resembling of the shape is becoming relatively messy. So it seems like you're losing maybe the shape information, but you're still aware that the distractors were green, although you were searching for the target based on being tilted to the left or something. So it's kind of reducing it. So the fact that the target and distractors are really, the feature is important to find it, kind of helps the encoding process
Mm-hmm.
of the shape of the shape one.
Awesome.
But mean and variance seem to come along more in task, like when it's task irrelevant.
Right. Very cool. Well, we're almost at time.